Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. We are an organization founded in the 1890s to perpetuate the study of early American history. I am Bob Allison, president of the society, and tonight we are holding our Donald Friary Symposium. Donald Friary, who is still very much with us, was president of the society for 14 years. He was born in Dorchester, then he went away to, well, first to Boston Latin, the oldest public school in the country, founded in 1635, and then he went to Brown University, and then earned his PhD in American Civilization from the University of Pennsylvania. And while he was in graduate school, he was appointed the head tutor at historic Deerfield, and his connection with historic Deerfield became a 40-plus year career, 27 or 28 of those years as the director of historic Deerfield. And in his tenure as director, he created fellowship programs bringing scholars to study the material culture of Deerfield and its many, many holdings, also enhancing the research agenda of historic Deerfield, and of course, most importantly, for the director of a museum, raising money to do all of these things, traveling around the country to bolster the endowment of historic Deerfield, which he then left in very good shape in 2003. And shortly after that, in his retirement, we were really fortunate that he became president of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. And also in his retirement, he has created an enterprise called History for Hire, where he not only leads tours for people to see historic sites around the country, he also presents as the Reverend William Bentley in Salem, and he also gave a very frightening presentation as the Reverend Samuel Parris, returning to Danvers after all these many years. So Donald Friary, we honor him with the Friary Symposium, and he's honored us with his wonderful attachment to the Colonial Society. So thank you for coming, Don.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bob. And our program tonight is on re-examining 18th century decorative arts in museums today. And the moderator is Nonie Gadsden. And Nonie has been a member of the Colonial Society now for 10 years.
Oh, good for me.
She is the Katherine Weems Senior Curator of American Decorative Arts and Sculpture at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. She earned her bachelor's degree from Yale College and then her master's from the Winter Third Program in Early American Culture at the University of Delaware. And her work in decorative arts and sculpture actually encompasses the Americas, North America, Central America, South America, from ancient times through the 20th century. Her recent work includes mounting an exhibit on Toshika Takeizu, shaping abstraction, as well as being lead curator for an exhibit on Women Take the Floor, as well as a program on art and jazz and folk meets modernism. She's also published a book, America Goes Modern and the Rise of Industrial Design. And if you ever have an opportunity to walk through the galleries of the American Wing with Nonie Gadsden, you should take it. You will be able to tell those stories for the rest of your life.
Yes.
So, and I want to thank Nonie for putting together this program and for joining us tonight for the Donald Friary Symposium on re-examining 18th century decorative arts in museums today. If you have questions and you're watching from afar, you can email us at colonialsociety@verizon.net, and operators are standing by to take care of it. And also, if you're watching from afar, you will not be able to enjoy the reception afterward, but I hope you will experience some of the conviviality here at the Colonial Society vicariously. So thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Don. And can everybody hear me okay? I'm speaking up, but we're also mic'd, so it feels weird to be talking loudly, but also mic'd. So I'm sure, this is my last comment to you, Jerry Ward, I know I'm speaking loudly. Thank you. But I'm thrilled to be here this evening, and thank you, Bob, and to the program manager of the Colonial Society and Cesare for this invitation. I'm delighted to present the Donald R. Friary Symposium. I've known Don Friary for over 20 years now, and had the pleasure of serving on the Colonial Society Council during his final years as president. When I was asked to honor him by presenting a panel on some topic related to the decorative arts, I jumped at the opportunity. As you all know, Don's contributions to the presentation and interpretation of decorative arts in museums, particularly historic Deerfield, are manifold. His commitment to excellence, be it scholarship, conservation, gallery displays, or storage facilities, is well known in the field, and resulted not only in numerous impressive exhibitions, but also in the grand achievement of the then very innovative and now frequently copied Flint Center for Early New England Life at Deerfield, which opened in 1998, which you see here. Today, just like Don did 25 years ago, my colleagues and I at the Museum of Fine Arts are rethinking our presentation of 18th century art in the Americas. Although the current displays that you see here are only 14 years old, the world has changed significantly in those years. A reimagining of our galleries is needed. In 2026, we plan to reinstall the entire first floor of the Art of the Americas wing to mark the 250th anniversary of our nation's founding. In this reinstallation, we have challenged ourselves to highlight underrepresented narratives in American history and art history. We want to push beyond the history of the great white men that you see lining the walls in these images, and to seek out more about women, Native Americans, Latin Americans, Asian Americans, African Americans, the working class, immigrants, and so much more. Through thoughtful object selections and juxtapositions, creative design, and probing new research, we hope to make our displays more inclusive of the diverse communities that lived in the colonial Americas. This is no easy task. To help me explore ways we can try to achieve these lofty goals, I have invited two brilliant scholars to join me this evening, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to introduce them now. There we go, some names. I'm first pleased to introduce Dr. R. Ruthie Dibble. Ruthie is the Robert N. Shapiro Curator of American Decorative Arts at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, a role she assumed last year in 2023. Ruthie had previously served as curator at the Chipstone Foundation in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and received her doctorate and master's in philosophy and history of art from Yale University, a Master of Art History from Williams College, and a Bachelor's in Art History from Hamilton College. Ruthie's curatorial work expands the field of American decorative arts by examining the global circulation of objects, the relationship between craft and industry, and the role of craftspeople as agents of social change. Her work emphasizes collaboration and community connection, both of the past and the present, to empower diverse perspectives and audiences. Welcome, Ruthie, and thank you for joining me this evening.
Glad to be here.
And next, I would like to introduce Lily Higgins. Lily is a PhD candidate in the history of art at Yale University. Working with my mentor and one of Ruthie's mentors, we're all Yaleys, sorry to say, the esteemed Edward S. Cook. Ned Cook has ignited many passions for the decorative arts over the last 30 years, and I am delighted to bring this small group together. And I hope you're watching, Ned. So prior to Yale, Lily received her master's from the Winterthur program in American Material Culture and her undergraduate degree from Harvard University. At least somebody went to school here in Boston. In her research, Lily explores material literacy in early America. Her dissertation project, titled Reading into Things, Articulate Objects in Colonial North America, brings together a selection of decorative arts objects from across the landscape of early America with self-referential imagery, or words embedded in their surfaces. By delving into the language not only of literal, written inscriptions, but also of form, materials, and ornament, her project questions the value that colonial makers and consumers place on material things, the cultural work they required objects to perform, and the specific kinds of agency that they believed these objects could possess. Welcome, Lily, and thank you also for joining us this evening, right as you take a sip. All right. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, my colleagues and I at the MFA want to bring overlooked narratives and histories to the MFA galleries. But how do we do that when the vast majority of our materials in the MFA collection, like most institutions, belonged to the elite? Our galleries currently look like this: a sea of white, wealthy faces surrounded by luxury goods. The fact of the matter is that the majority of objects that survive from the 18th century belong to the same wealthy families that built the MFA 150 years ago. So how do we go about telling a more diverse stories? We're exploring a range of different approaches to achieve this. This could mean including new kinds of objects that were previously excluded from our displays, such as the integration of indigenous materials to reflect the vitally important native presence, rather than our current practice of separating out indigenous art in its own gallery. Or more thoughtful and creative displays of new acquisitions, such as our great desk and bookcase made in Puebla, Mexico in the mid-18th century, an intensely global object. This could also mean pointing out the blatant absence of some communities from the visual historical record, such as we did when we installed this empty frame with the label, "Who is Missing?" This would also mean offering new stories about well-known objects in the MFA collections and engaging with members of our community with different backgrounds to seek out what about these works speak to them. During the pandemic, when we were all home and away from the galleries, my colleagues and I conceived of a multilingual project that we called Translating American Stories. We recruited members of the MFA staff who speak the 4 languages spoken most in Boston after English, and that's Spanish, Mandarin Chinese, Haitian Creole, and Portuguese. We split into groups to examine and create new labels for major works in our collection, such as the Liberty Bowl, which I took on, taking the lead on the interpretation from our multilingual colleagues. They were asked what in this work would be of interest and compelling to your communities. We crafted the labels together, then they did a sensitive translations into their own languages. We put these translations up in our galleries and recorded them on our multilingual media guide for visitors to hear themselves. I led the group that tackled the Liberty Bowl, the Sons of Liberty Bowl, and since we had 4 sides of the case, we just experimented and decided why not bring speakers from all 4 languages in together. We won't do that again. But it proved to be challenging to have so many different opinions and points of view. But each person who I met with, who we all met together, said something or made some observation that really blew my mind and gave me a whole new perspective on this object I thought I knew so well. I will never forget when the Spanish speaker, Jasmine Perez, from our Learning and Community Engagement Department, looked at the Liberty Bowl and said, "Honestly, I've never stopped to look at it. It's just a wonky, dirty silver bowl. If it had been important, it would have been made in gold." Oh. That was a fascinating cultural response that was, why hadn't I thought of that before? And so my collaborators were so taken by the story behind this bowl, they declared that the label needed to read like a novella. So we tried to make it as interesting, as risque. It's a really fun story, but how do we make that in 150 words in 5 different languages? So we did our best. Yet with reimagining our galleries, we also don't want to fall into the trap of damning all of 18th century society for social practices and economic realities that we do not condone today. We want to acknowledge the histories of forced labor and oppression, but without confining the stories of some communities to only those experiences. We want to tell a more complex history of these diverse global communities that celebrates resilience and achievement. What can visitors today learn from these works? How does it relate to our lives today? What does it tell us about communities of the past? What does it tell us about communities today? It's one thing to present these narratives successfully on paper. It is a very different thing to present them successfully in a museum gallery for a general public audience. Gallery displays must be beautiful, or at least intriguing, visually intriguing to even get the visitor's attention. Gallery displays can't put a dissertation on the label. This is certainly still a work in progress and in process. But so why not present some ideas to this astute crowd of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts and elicit your feedback? So you didn't know, but you're all going to be part of this conversation tonight. This evening, each of us, the three of us, will offer a brief presentation on a single 18th century object made in Massachusetts. We all chose well-known objects and want to delve into their history to reveal some new narratives that may open up different stories. Then I will start off our discussion with some questions of how to bring these stories into the galleries, and I hope you will all participate. So, Ruthie, I turn it over to you. You get to be the first one.
All right. Thank you, Nonie. I've learned so much, too, about what you were up to during the pandemic. It's very impressive. Okay. So the object I selected to talk about today is this beautiful side chair from the Peabody Essex Museum's collection. But Nonie asked me if I could think about something that might be in the MFA's collection, and I said, why don't I choose something that's in many important collections?
Yes. We've got one, too.
Yeah, exactly. So this chair, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It was made of maple and ash, and it was painted by unknown artisans sometime between 1795 and 1799, thought to have been in Salem, although I know there's some controversy around that. It was commissioned by the Salem merchant and America's first millionaire, which you hear a lot in Salem, Elias Haskett Derby. It was originally part of a suite of 24 chairs, many of which were handed down in the family and preserved. And because of that, there are numerous, nearly identical examples in other museums and private collections. MFA Boston, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Chipstone Foundation. So, as renowned examples of the kind of immense refinement and transatlantic command of good taste in Salem in the early Republic, and kind of as an example of what it looked like to be the most cosmopolitan family in early New England. These chairs have long been esteemed by American furniture historians and decorative arts historians. They're also considered to be innovative in the sense that they are the first example of furniture in early America to introduce this type of painting on furniture that was be described as like fancy painting, right? So this is like coming after Japanning, and it's this moment where we're really seeing New England decorative arts embrace the fanciful and the neoclassical. So just to recap the form a little, these are balloon back chairs, and they have straight-sided front legs and spade feet in the front. And the form is based on a print from Hepplewhite's The Cabinet Maker and Upholsterer's Guide from 1788. So we're saying about a decade later, this form has made it to New England for the first time. And I'll go into this a little more, but the chair at the Peabody Essex Museum has this blue upholstery because my predecessor, Dean's research, suggested that it was in a room that had a blue and white color scheme, and that there was some trace of blue fabric. So we might think of this as like one of the more accurate upholstery jobs on these chairs. But maybe the most remarkable feature of the chair is its elaborate painted scheme. There are flowers, there are feathers, ribbons, gilt ornament. The flowers break down into little like blue cornflowers and then rosebuds hanging from ribbons, these kind of blue satin ribbons. Hepplewhite, actually, in the Cabinet Maker's Guide, he describes this new and elegant fashion of painting chairs and says that it affords the opportunity by the variety of grounds which may be introduced to make the whole accord in harmony with a pleasing and striking effect to the eye. So that phrase, like pleasing and striking effect to the eye, is really why these chairs were called fancy chairs. Like even in the early, in this period, it's a period term, because the decorations were meant to appeal to the mind's fancy, as it was then known. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir, but this is a neologism that's coined in around 1711 and really spelled out by Joseph Addison in The Spectator in the early 18th century. Fancy describes all that was opposed to reason and the part of the mind that reacts imaginatively to novel stimuli, visual stimuli especially. So all that is great and strange or beautiful, things that trigger pleasure and delight, and above all, subjective and even capricious associations. I like very much this Coleridge quote where he says, "The fancy is indeed no more than a mode of memory emancipated from the order of time and space." So it's really just like delighting in the illogical. So these chairs may not seem surprising to our eyes, but I having spent a lot of time in Milwaukee looking at one during the pandemic, I really started to appreciate how strange they must have been, in the sense that we have, hard wood that paint is transforming into soft ribbons and feathers. We have different flowers growing from the same vine across the top. And we have many colors in the place of sober brown wood. So when you think about these chairs as an opportunity to sit on flowers, essentially, they do actually become really wonderfully fanciful. And I love these chairs so much. So a little bit about Elias Haskett Derby. This is a posthumous portrait painted by James Frothingham. It's in Pem's collection. He, was the owner of the Grand Turk, so the first New England vessel to successfully trade with China. He made a lot of money trading with the Far East, and he was based in Salem. He was also inherited a fortune from his father, who was a very successful merchant. And with his money, he decided to build this magnificent Salem mansion. So in 1795, he and his wife, Elizabeth, began to plan building the largest and most ostentatious home in this booming port city. It was called by one visitor more of a palace than a dwelling of an American merchant. So you can see it in a drawing on the left. And there's an example of the tea house that survives. It's owned by the Peabody Essex Museum. In terms of location, they chose a lot that was 6 blocks away from the bustling wharf and where his father had lived. So they're kind of distancing themselves from that kind of gritty, laborious part of town. And they commissioned Charles Bulfinch to provide an initial design, then hired Samuel McIntyre to finalize the plan for the mansion and outbuildings and oversee the construction and provide a coherent scheme of architectural ornament and furniture for the most important interior spaces. So this mansion was kind of so large and impractical that it was demolished in 1816, so it really didn't stand very long. But we know it through bills and drawings and written descriptions and surviving furnishings and architectural fragments. So we know the chairs were made for a back drawing room and were part of what Dean has called the estate's coordinated interior. It was on the first floor. It had a blue and white color scheme. It had carved woodwork by McIntyre with cornucopia and floral swags. The fireplace surround for this room is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And there were, interestingly, there were floral elements throughout the architectural carvings that Samuel McIntyre created. So you can see in the drawings on the left from our collection, these rosettes that, and then swags kind of coordinating with the chairs. And then in this bill from McIntyre, I've underlined some of the several moments where he's listing these rose features. So in that way, the chair is incredibly coordinated, or the suite of chairs is incredibly coordinated with the architecture. But the chairs were also coordinated with the exterior of the house. So the floor-to-ceiling windows in the drawing room looked out on Derby's garden. And it was said that Derby would ask ship captains to bring him back interesting specimens for his gardens from ports in China, Batavia, Sumatra, West Indies, the Atlantic Islands. And the mansion boasted terrace gardens and greenhouses. And so you can imagine these chairs sitting in this room and this visual layering of the chairs with the floral elements, and then this garden beyond with more floral elements. So, and we have wonderful quotes from a young woman named Elizabeth Southgate, who visited the house a couple years after Derby died in 1799. But she talks about the variety of flowers And she says there were 10,000 different kinds of flowers from all corners of the globe. And then she goes on to have this lovely, fanciful reverie. Imagination luxuriates with delight. And it plays over the beauties of the opening flower, imperceptibly wanders to the, So she's just an example of what people were supposed to experience when they visited this wondrous place. So, but I think it's also important to think about how this garden was organized around a colonialist logic of collecting. So you have these botanical specimens that are being unmoored, uprooted from their, indigenous ecosystems, and then, and kind of geographic contingencies, and brought through the kind of power and wealth of this one person into a new place and a new set of relationships that are, what is the organizing principle? One person's taste, right? So there's this way that Derby is reorganizing the world in a very beautiful way. And the chair, with this fanciful combination of cornflowers and rosebuds, growing off of the same vine, is doing the same thing, right? It's like combining all these different things that don't necessarily belong together. So there's this theme of flowers running across the gardens, the architecture, and the furnishings, but it also extends to the people who labored for the Derbys. So Elias Haskett Derby actually enslaved two different women named Rose. The first appears in the kind of archive in 1777. This is this document, when a freedman named Salem Lane accused Elias Haskett Derby of mistreating Rose, who is described as a lifelong servant in the Derby household. He testifies that he and Rose had married, but when Rose attempted to live with her husband, Derby held her in captivity over a 2-year period and, quote, assaulted and then and there most cruelly bruised and evilly mistreated her, and threatened to sell her to Carolinas. So Rose's ultimate fate has not yet been uncovered, but the records indicate that a year after this, Salem Lane announced his intentions to marry a different woman, a woman named Venus Kitchen. And this is the last evidence we've found of Rose. So it's not clear what happens to her. But 10 years after Salem Lane testified about this, you see a second Rose appearing in the Derby family records. And this is a young black girl who's about 10 years old. And he records paying for 6 months of her schooling, as well as schooling for another black child, a boy named Sabe, which is a name that probably derives from the Yoruba state of Sabe. So in one town record, this Rose is identified as Rose Lane, which is possible evidence that the older Rose was her mother and that she is the daughter of Rose and Salem Lane. And so, between 1777, when this first Rose appears, and 1788, when we learn of the second Rose, Massachusetts has abolished slavery, right? 1783. But Rose and Sabe, while legally, free, they're really not. It's this kind of category that is called by scholars today as unfree. They still were described as having belonged to Elias Haskett Derby, and they lived with him until his death in 1799. And so when Derby died, Sabe was paid 2 years' worth of back wages and interest from the estate settlement. So you can imagine if you're not getting paid when you're living in a household, it's kind of hard to walk away. So this kind of state of unfreeness. Thinking about the name Rose, and it's the name Rose and its coincidence with the rose that grew on and embellished Derby's estate, I think there's a meaning there. So one of the things I looked into is that white colonists and their descendants rarely named white women Rose. Genealogists have observed that women named Rose emigrated to England, but the use of that name dropped off in subsequent generations. And instead, the name became more widespread among African diasporic women in the 18th century. And it's a name that kind of, it elides a woman and object and person and property, and it refines, I think, when applied to a young black woman in Salem who's enslaved, it refines enslavement into the tending of fragile property, right? And it kind of is one of these subtle ways that enslavement masquerades as refinement, that we're giving this young woman this name. So what does this have to do with the chair? I mean, one is that there are rosebuds on the chair, right? And I think we can read into the symbolism of the chair this hidden language and possibly of personal significance to Derby. The other is that I'm really interested in fancy's relationship to power, and particularly overpowerment, being overpowered, which is what Eliza Southgate is describing in her experience of the garden, and how the chair can be seen to represent that power. I pulled some quotes that I've looked at over the years that fascinate me about fancy. So one is another one from Eliza Southgate, where I'm not going to read the whole thing, but in bold she says, "I could not realize everything and expected every moment that the wand of the fairy would sweep all from before my eyes and leave me to stare and wonder what it meant." So, it's the beauty of Derby's estate is so overwhelming that she's overpowered. And then a couple of quotes from Addison where he's talking about the power of color in fancy. And he said, "We are struck, we know not how, with the symmetry of anything we see, and immediately assent to the beauty of an object without inquiring into the particular causes and occasions of it," right? Which is like such an interesting power that beauty can have in this moment where all these complicated and disturbing things are happening in the world. And then he also talks about how polite imagination gives a person, he's using him, but a kind of property in everything he sees, and makes the most rude and uncultivated parts of nature administer to his pleasures. So one other person who I think is an important interlocutor in this is Phyllis Wheatley. Her poem on imagination talks about the moral dimensions of imagination and sets up this contrast between fancy and the imagination. Fancy, in its overpowering nature, is akin to enslavement. Imagination is a kind of higher knowledge that bestows power. Wheatley, like Addison, sees fancy as kind of this wild counterpart to imagination. And she describes fancy as a kind of enslavement. And she says it's a roving entity whose silken fetters all the senses bind, and soft captivity involves the mind. And I'm just so struck by how her imagery evokes the Derby chairs, right? That they have these silken fetters on them, and there's this softness to them, but there's still this imagery of boundedness and binding with the ribbons. What types of soft captivity these fanciful silken fetters might represent on the chair? Refinement, domesticity, femininity, enslavement. It's referencing a mode of imagination that emerges in the 18th century and is explored as a way to describe internal power dynamics that people throughout the Atlantic world are also seeing carried out in their households, docks, shipyards, politics, and economies. And people in the long 18th century located power in beauty. So the things that seem simply beautiful are likely to also be powerful if we interrogate them closely. This power shapes early American decorative arts, often in ways that can be hard to see. And just to speak to some of the brilliant things that Nonie brought up, I am super inspired by this paragraph from Kenneth Lockridge, where he talks about kind of the legacy of how it's impossible to be inheritor this way of looking at the world, and that he's trying to break out of this, what he calls the business of paradox, that really it's not about this chair has a paradoxical relationship to the disturbing parts of 18th century history, but it's really looking at the world and these individuals more wholly and fully. And one of the things that I'm trying to think about this with this research is, does this chair tell us about the roses, or does it tell us more about Eliza Haskett Derby? And maybe in the midst of us needing to understand and highlight these unsung figures like the roses, we also need to look at people like Eliza Haskett Derby more wholly and more fully, and really pay attention to kind of creating three-dimensional characters across the board in the way that we interpret historical decorative arts. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ruthie. Yeah. I'm going to hold all comments until we all finish. So I'm going to ask Lily to go.
Well, Ruthie, that was fantastic. Some interesting.
We can go back to that at some point, but this is a label I attempted to write about all this in 150 words for the Art Museum. But let's truly continue.
It's a wonderful label.
Sure.
Right.
You can come back.
And I know this table.
Yeah, you know this table very well. Thanks, Ruthie, for thinking of my name when you had this last minute change to the panel structure.
Yeah.
Nonie, thanks so much for the invitation to be part of the panel.
Yeah.
And I am delighted to be here speaking about this object, partly because many years ago now, I encountered it in the trip to Chipstone as part of Chipstone's Object Lab, where I first sort of fell in love with and met the 18th century and 18th century decorative art. So it's very wonderful to be here speaking about this fantastic piece. This card table and companion fire screen came into the Chipstone collection in 1972 when they were acquired from descendants of William Samuel Johnson. And here's a quote: "In the furniture of the olden time," published in 1901, Francis Clary Morse, himself a descendant of the Massachusetts elite, reflected that the needlework table cover was worked in turn by each of the four daughters of William Samuel Johnson, and he romantically imagines how each daughter picked up the needle as the last laid it down with her life. So, although this is a wonderfully expressive reading, not only is it inconsistent with how we believe 18th century needlework was made, not by group effort typically, but the myth is at odds with or incompatible with the object itself, which is essentially a table for gambling, intended also as a site for rituals of courtship to unfold, and by all accounts, a highly social object. Although a card table may seem a strange choice for a schoolgirl embroidery project, thematically the table is aligned with the popular fishing girl style of embroidery pieces that can be read as allegorical depictions of courtship. And at the other end of the spectrum, we get, from Morse's reading of piety, diligence, and submission, we might place this Hogarth painting, which I recently saw at the Albright Knox in Buffalo, that offers a contemporary perspective on the perils and pleasures of the card table. The title of the painting is The Lady's Last Stake. It's decadent and moralizing, and it features both a fire screen and a card table. You can see that she is like holding on to that fire screen for dear life with her last little ounce of virtue. So William Samuel Johnson actually had not 4 but 5 daughters, and he outlived them all. And the oldest, Charity Johnson, is likely the maker of these pieces. She attends school in Boston in the late 1760s when the pieces were made. And during this time, actually from 1767 to 1771, quite a long time, her father, William Samuel Johnson, is in London. He's there to represent the interests of Connecticut colony, this is the Connecticut family from Stratford, before the Crown in the Mason case, which is kind of a landmark land dispute with the Mohegans. So some background. The needlework has been specifically worked to the dimensions of the purchase table, and it actually covers the gorgeous surface of the mahogany, which had, as we know, so much appeal for 18th century consumers, to create a soft, tactile, and less slippery surface for playing cards and gaming tokens. Although unlabeled, the table is attributed to Benjamin Frothingham of Charlestown, Massachusetts. The brightly colored silks and wools, worked on a loose woven linen backing, would probably have been purchased from the instructor. Some of these women were merchants in their own right, and the materials made up the bulk of the expense of this kind of education. The embroidery is worked mostly in a simple tent stitch by making small diagonal stitches across the woven background, choosing and blending the colors of wool in a way that brings the design to life is really where the artistry in these pieces can be seen. And the faded background, which has been touched up on the card table, shows the two different dye lots of the red dye that have aged, and how the artist may have worked the background in sort of staggering blocks to blend them. So that gives us a little bit of insight into the process of completing these fairly large works. When Charity dies, her inventory lists no card table, but an unfinished needlework coat of arms. And in her letters from the 1760s, she asks her father to send the family coat of arms from the Office of Heraldry in London, presumably as a design source for this no longer surviving piece. Searching for the possible Johnson coat of arms embroidery, I was able to rifle through Litterature's collection of Martha Gandy Fales' wonderful archive of research into American heraldic imagery, gathered from all kinds of different sources, and found this clipping for the needlework coat of arms of the Yabez Bowen family of Rhode Island, advertised by Oliver's Auctions in the 80s. And next to the Bowen coat of arms was a fire screen that was nearly identical, at least in black and white, to the chipstone example, but sold after it had already entered the true chipstone piece had entered that collection. So, this doppelganger reveals that the underdrawing of the chipstone fire screen, which seems to owe a debt to design sources like Ferber's flowers, derives from a circulating source, probably drawn by a professional artist, and that was transferred to the ground of the work. So more insight into the process of making these things. The design of the chipstone table, on the other hand, is more unusual, more simply rendered, and it's highly imaginative. It features a central motif of an urn with a flowering tree of life, flanked by peacocks. Ultimately, this imagery derived from textiles imported from India, and variations on it became popular motifs in American needlework in a whole variety of different media and forms, such as this elaborate sconce, also at Winterthur, made by a Connecticut schoolgirl in Boston. The surrounding images are from the sketchbook of Philadelphia schoolgirl and needlework student Anne Flowers, again from Winterthur, which are in turn based on printed sources from pattern books, including Augustin Haeckel's The Florist and Gerard Dolores' 1719 Les Principes de Design. So these images really illustrate the process of transforming the printed sources into drawing and then possibly combining these motifs in elegant ways to suit the piece of work at hand. And some of Anne Flower's needlework does survive, so it's really interesting to see that process in her own work as well. I'm speculating about this piece. While 18th century card tables are relatively common, surviving needlework tops are rare. But there are others, all descended, as Nonie's intro suggested, in Massachusetts families and associated with names that are still very well known to us. So one made by Mercy Otis Warren to fit the top of a card table purchased by her father as part of her wedding dowry, now at Hilton Hall in Plymouth. A matched set of 2 card tables, and at least one fire screen that descended in the Faneuil family, which I show here with another piece sold by the Hubers that, I don't know if it was part of the set or if it simply shares a common design source. Those are really interesting, sweet. An oval table from the MFA that was probably an older table updated with a cover that descended in the Dummer family. And owning objects like these connected elite families to one another, just as the experience of going to school together with daughters from other prosperous families cemented lifelong relationships. The letters that William Samuel Johnson exchanges with his circle of chaperones and confidants to arrange his daughter's education, her lodging, and suitable social outings is really a medium through which he participates in the building of this shared sense of social identity and responsibility. While all kinds of people played cards in the 18th century, including an enslaved man in the senior William Samuel Johnson's father, Samuel Johnson's New York household, which was really part of their extended household and managed by William Samuel Johnson's first wife, Anne Beach. So all kinds of people played cards, including an enslaved man in that New York household named Horace, who is recorded as being punished for falling into bad company that leads to gaming. The table, decorated with the handiwork of one of the Johnson daughters at this expensive finishing school, makes a strong statement about who is allowed to play and under what precise terms. But nevertheless, this object would have been present in the household and handled by and seen by other people as well. And the Johnsons certainly relied on enslaved labor. I think in the year 1767, they had 4 enslaved people working in their household for them. In the collection of the Massachusetts Historical Society is a final notable card table. Made like the Johnson table in Charleston, Massachusetts in the 1760s, it is prized not for its needlework cover nor for its finely figured surface, but for its provenance. The static leaf that does not move when the table is being folded up is carved with chiseled surface to fit a cover or felt top, square corner depressions, and deep oval recesses for gaming tokens, revealing its initial unrealized inclination to become a card table. Instead, placed in the right hands, it became a writing desk. The table is believed to have been the writing desk of Phyllis Wheatley Peters. Unlike the Johnson table, an already specialized form made even more so by the textile cover, this smooth top table was inherently flexible. The Wheatley table could be closed and pushed aside during the day or opened for a late night of work while the rest of the family slept. Later inherited by Phyllis Wheatley by the family that enslaved her, the table, a table of her own to write at, was we might call it a gift that came at a high cost. The table could be read as embodying the poet's position in the Wheatley household. While highly valued as a productive member of the family unit and therefore able and permitted to pursue her art, she was isolated by her exceptionalism and actively discouraged from developing her own independent adult life and family beyond that unit. The needlework cover of the Johnson table enhances our interpretation of the Wheatley table as both a card and a writing desk. The rendering of mother of pearl, fish, and sea creature shaped tokens references the sea. They reference the sea in both their material and their shape. Phyllis Wheatley herself is famously named or renamed upon her arrival in North America after the slave trafficking ship that brings her to Boston. While she dedicated the poem Ode to Neptune to an unknown woman patron to wish her a safe journey to London, we could also read that poem as Wheatley's own wish of a safe passage for herself, when in 1773 she risked not only her life to journey to London, but also risked her life in a way in returning back, where her freedom to Boston was not yet assured. She agreed to return, it seems, to care for the ailing Susanna Wheatley. And David Waldstreicher's somewhat new biography, titled aptly The Odyssey of Phyllis Wheatley, makes the claim that she may have returned as part of a bargain to secure her freedom, that it was a trade-off. So this is no small gamble. The circular composition of the card table, like a churning sea or the revolving door of fate, calls out to our imaginations. Morse recognized in this piece a sad reflection on fate and mortality, and while I see it as a much more hopeful and dynamic piece, for 18th century players, the sea, like the gaming table, indeed offered the opportunity for spectacular gains or terrible losses that mirrored the realities of their maritime-based economy, which traded in both goods and human lives. The imaginative trompe-l'oeil needlework pulls us in even now to participate in the spectacle of the game and to contemplate personal and political risk as a central and compelling theme in early American life and art on the eve of the Revolution.
Thank you. Wonderful. May I grab that from you?
Sure.
And I will give you our final, and then we'll get. Oh, hey, that's me. All right.
Thank you.
So many thanks to Ruthie and Lily for those thoughtful and penetrating presentation of objects that we thought we had known so well. And I will now present briefly on the two-handled covered cup you see here, made by Jacob Hurd in the MFA collection. I'll quickly touch upon many different stories that could be addressed with this object, from the more traditional to some of the more contemporary views. Then I'm going to challenge you all to help us figure out ways of sharing this range of stories in the galleries. Standing 13.5 inches tall, this judgy-looking object appears as if it's standing with its hand on its hips, ready to admonish you. It screams authority, power, and privilege. From its haughty stance, to its architectural stepped lid and foot, to its heraldic engraving, this piece demands attention and respect. And made of over 76 ounces of silver, the piece clearly conveys wealth and luxury. The cup was made in the 1740s for John Roe, an English immigrant who arrived in Boston in 1736. Roe was ambitious. He purchased what is now Roe's Wharf, still here in Boston, soon after his arrival, as well as a warehouse in what is now the North End, and he owned tons of property. He built a large house on Ponds Lane. Here you see a drawing of that house. Ponds Lane is now Bedford Street, and owned significant property right near it. You can see underneath where his house is in red, that whole area is Roe's Field. So he owns an enormous amount of land. So he clearly came over with a significant amount of money to be able to start off so well and so quickly. He continued as a merchant and imported a wide range of goods, pretty much what people needed, from textiles to wine to other supplies, salt and so forth. He owned one of the ships that held the tea in the Boston Tea Party, much later than this object, but he was the owner of the Eleanor, which is my full name, so I always remember that. But that's where he did not own the tea, however, but he owned the ship. He was very active in his community. He was a fire ward. He held local political roles. He was a member of the Wednesday Night Club, which I need to learn more about. It's not the Wednesday Evening Club of later fame. It's the Wednesday Night Club, and I need to learn. The Merchants Club. He attended meetings of the Posse, another merchants group that met. And he was a very active member of the Young Trinity Church. He was also initiated into the first lodge of Freemasons in Boston in 1740. Just a few years after that lodge was founded, and was accepted into full membership in 1747, and continued to rise in St. John's Lodge until he was appointed Grand Master of the American Colonies for the modern sect of Masons in 1768. And for those of you who know the Masons, you know that there was the modern and there were the ancients, and this is the modern sect that he became that Roe became the Grand Master for, while the St. Andrew's Lodge was the ancient sect, and that one had more of the Paul Revere's and some more of the more radical revolutionaries. The modern sect had more of the English-leaning members of the community. And he held that position for from 1768 until his death in 1787. In 1743, at the age of 28, Roe married 18-year-old Hannah Speakman, the daughter of an industrious baker who diligently built his own fortune. A few years later, Hannah's sister, Susanna, married another rising star in Boston, George Inman. Roe and Inman became close friends and partners. Roe used all of these positions strategically, and all of these roles and the connections he had to build his network of power and influence and to grow his mercantile empire. He was known for his dinner parties he threw and his many dignitaries that he entertained in his home. There's a diary of Roe's that exists from the 1760s and 1770s that are just these amazing lists of people who dined at his home or whose funeral he went to and who were the pallbearers, and just a wonderful sort of just chronicle of life in Boston in the 1760s and 70s leading up to the Revolution. Roe was very careful in keeping a foot on both sides of the line. He was often seen as very Tory-leaning, but he is known to have supported patriotic causes, particularly when it helped his bottom line. So he was a practical political member of the society. But Roe was a mover and a shaker, and he liked to be at the center of things. Often he took the leadership roles. In 1748, at the age of 33, Roe commissioned leading portrait artist Robert Feek to paint both himself and his wife, Hannah, then aged 23. In his picture, you can feel the ambition and the energy of Roe, who looks directly at the sitter with friendly yet piercing eyes. He is not surrounded by numerous accoutrements, but simply shown as well-dressed, well-coiffed, relaxed, but in control. Hannah's portrait does a little bit more to emphasize their wealth, with the folds of expensive silk surrounding her and the landscape in the background. And she doesn't seem quite as relaxed as he does, well, maybe a little bit haughty, and she almost like she's looking down her nose at you. But these were pretty young to have this portrait made. And obviously, self-presentation was important from a very early age. Roe also adopted a coat of arms. And I, too, have been trying to search through Martha Gandy Fales and her work on the Colonial Society website, thank you very much, on the role of heraldry. And I still have a lot to learn in that regard. Here is his coat of arms, and there's a lot of questions about colonial American use of heraldry, and I haven't gotten to the bottom of all of it yet. But we do know that many wealthy colonial patrons used coats of arms and crests, sometimes without the appropriate permissions so strictly enforced in Britain. The coat of arms gave them an air of pretension, of status. It was another aspect of this self-fashioning. Roe prominently showed his coat of arms on the two-handled cup that we will be going back to. The cup had been made by Boston's leading silversmith of the era, Jacob Hurd. When Jacob Hurd made this cup, at some point in the 1740s, he was at the peak of his career. Boston-born, or really Charlestown-born, Hurd was in his 40s at the time. He was well-connected, hard-working, and counted many of Boston's elite families as his clients. He is believed to have been the most prolific Boston silversmith of the mid-18th century. Over 500 pieces with his mark are known to survive, which accounts for more than 50% of the silver made in his generation, including many of the high-profile presentation pieces and silver commissions for churches in the area. The two-handled cup Hurd made for Roe was known as a grace cup, and sometimes referred to as a loving cup or a bishop's cup. The grace cup dates back to British medieval times and was primarily used and got its name from being used after grace at the end of a meal. Grace was said before and after the meal. And then after the grace was said, this cup was passed around hand to hand, that's thus the two handles. It would be filled with wine or wine-based punch and handed around the table for everybody to enjoy. It was associated with good cheer, camaraderie, and many toasts. Bishop's cup, that refers to a drink called bishop, a sweet drink made of wine, citrus, usually oranges or lemons, and sugar mixed with mulled and spiced port. The drink was usually consumed warm. One can imagine this massive cup being passed from hand to hand at one of Roe's many dinner parties. John Roe's cup was not the first example of this form that Hurd created. The form was known to exist in Boston as early as 1731. Prominent merchant Thomas Hancock commissioned this example with his own crest and coat of arms from London silversmith George Wicks, also in the MFA's Art of Europe collection. Hi, Tom. The coat of arms represents Hancock impaling henchmen, indicating it was created after Hancock's 1731 marriage to Lydia Henchman. As Hancock was also a client of Heard's, it is likely that the Boston silversmith was familiar with the Wicks example. It is no surprise, therefore, that when Heard was commissioned to make an example that now survives in the Metropolitan Museum's collection with the cipher WC, that it bears a striking resemblance to the British example. The original ownership of the Met's Grace Cup is not known, but it wasn't Heard's only example of this form. In the late fall, or summer or fall of 1744, quote, several of ye merchants in Boston presented this example, made by Heard and now in the collections of the Yale University Art Gallery, to Commander Edward Tyng, a British sea captain. The Boston merchants wanted to show their appreciation for Tyng's actions capturing a French privateer ship that had been plaguing the merchant ships along the eastern seaboard. John Roe, always part of the scene, was surely one of the merchants who commissioned this showy award. In December of that same year, 1744, a second example made by Heard was presented to a British captain, Richard Spry, also by several of ye merchants in Boston, for his taking of a French privateer. That example remains in private hands, and I'm sorry I don't have an image of it, but it was very similar to Tyng's cup seen here. And of course, John Roe was likely part of the commissioning of the cup for Richard Spry as well. We do not know when or why Roe's cup was made, but scholars have dated it to the 1740s due to its strong resemblance with these two works that we have seen, and based on Heard's marks, the evolution of his marking and the various styles. And Roe's likely involvement with the two presentation cups made in 1744 may have whet his appetite to own something like that for himself. The most notable event in the 1740s for Roe was his marriage in May of 1743 to Hannah Speakman. From Roe's later diary entries, we know that many of the weddings he attended in the 1760s and 70s included a celebratory dinner afterwards with merriment, including drinking and sometimes dancing. Could this grace cup have been made to commemorate Roe's marriage, and was it passed around by wedding guests during the celebration? It's possible. But I have trouble imagining Hannah Speakman bellying up to this heavy cup in a genteel manner. It seems more of a male practice. Maybe that's because I went to Yale and the famous Maury's cups were such a Yale practice. And I have a whole other side topic on that, which I will go into later for those who are interested. It's also possible that the cup was made at another time after the two other presentation cups were made in 1744. Hannah's father, William Speakman, died in 1746, and the Roes likely inherited some significant money at that time. In 1747, Roe was accepted into membership by St. John's Lodge, indicating his rising prominence in social and political circles. He certainly was thinking about self-presentation in 1748 when he had Feek paint the portraits of himself and Hannah. I tend to think that this cup was made in the mid to late 1740s, but that's just a hunch. But what about Jacob Heard? What was going on in his life when he made this cup? By the middle of the 1740s, Heard's wife, Elizabeth Mason, had given birth to 12 of their eventual 14 children, one of which, his son Nathaniel, was currently training with his father in his shop to be a silversmith. Another son, Benjamin, born in 1739, would join later. As Colonial Society member and silver scholar Barbara Ward noted in her entry about Heard, Heard's large shop, large volume of commissions, and the large and growing size of his family, combined with the runaway inflation that dogged Boston in the 1740s, ultimately led to Heard's ruin. A high-profile lawsuit between Heard and Benjamin Bourne in 1746 illustrates that the high interest rates, 30 to 34%, that Heard was forced to assume to purchase the metal he needed to fulfill the commissions, likely Roe's cup, which required 76 ounces of silver, was among them. Due to all these factors, by 1755, Heard was bankrupt. He moved out of Boston to Roxbury and died of a stroke just 3 years later. While we look at this fancy and luxurious works in silver, we often don't think of the lives of the talented craftsmen who created them and how precarious their lives were in the tumultuous colonial economy. In the mid-1740s, when he likely made this cup for John Roe, Jacob Hurd may have been at his peak in terms of influence and reputation, but he was on a slippery slope, which landed him insolvent just a few years later. And speaking of silver, where did that silver that cost Hurd so much come from? During the 18th century, the most silver circulating in the Anglo-European world came from the Potosi mines in New Spain, what is now called Bolivia. These mines were harvested by enslaved workers, both African and indigenous backgrounds. The silver likely traveled from Potosi to Europe, where it was probably fashioned into an object or coinage. Then that object would have been brought to the North American colonies, where it was melted down to be formed into something new. The silver had quite an adventure, including witnessing the horrors of forced labor, as it traveled around the globe before becoming a raw material for John Roe's cup. How do we share that story of global commerce in our gallery? In fact, Roe's fortune was built, at least in part, on the backs of enslaved laborers. In July 1746, right around the time I think he commissioned this cup, he placed an advertisement in the Boston Evening Post in which he offered to purchase, quote, some Negroes that can work at the carpenter's trade. In February 47, as advertisement in the same paper, he posted, quote, if any person has any Negroes to dispose of that can work in the carpenter's, blacksmith, or cooper's business, they may apply to him for a purchaser. For all of his magnanimous support of the Boston community, Hurd, like many of his contemporaries, purchased, owned, and sold black lives. It makes you look at the cup a little differently. There were also enslaved people working in Roe's home. They were likely the people responsible for cleaning, polishing, or caring for this very cup. In his diary that dates from the 1760s, Roe notes at least the names of 2 enslaved people, Cato, whom he unceremoniously, quote, and this is quoting his diary, disposed of in 1768 by sending him to work on a sugar plantation in Jamaica, and Marcellus, who is mentioned in 1772 after he was injured by others. Roe made sure that Marcellus's abusers were held responsible and even sent to jail. Did Cato, Marcellus, or other unnamed enslaved people care for this massive and even gaudy silver cup? Did they fill it with the expensive wines and punches for Roe and his contemporaries to enjoy? How do we share their stories? I, for one, do not have all the answers yet. But we know that there was a wider community in Boston than Roe and his cronies. Their histories are part of these objects as well. But how do we share those stories without harping on oppression? How do we illustrate the stories of resilience and creativity that we do not have a visual record for? And that is where I will stop at this time and open this up. I'm going to start with a few questions for my fellow panelists, and then I really hope that you will help us think about this. One of the reasons when Don asked me to present this panel, I thought, well, great, let's get more voices. Let's get more people thinking about this, because my colleagues and I are thinking about this, and we don't have all the answers yet. So I will go to Ruthie and Lily and say that all of these presentations provided us with a wealth of interesting information and context for these objects. How do we get that across in a museum setting without putting a novel on the wall? Ruthie, what was the impact of that label that you briefly showed us when it was in Milwaukee? Sure.
Yeah. I have anecdotal information. One is that I took 5 college students on a tour of the museum with multiple other curators. We walked through many galleries, And at the end, we said, what was your favorite part? And they said, the furniture gallery. So I was pretty excited about that. They meant the Chipstone Gallery. But, and I also have heard from the Molecular Art Museum has a social justice tour theme that they organize tours around. And they've said that this gallery has been, that this chair is in with this label, has been very successful and useful. And they have appreciated how I attempted to write kind of narratival labels that tell a story, and I think that, yeah, and of course this label doesn't even cover half of the things that I talked about in my talk, but I tried to narrow it down to what's the essence of this story that would be surprising to someone looking at this chair. Yeah, so I think it's positive, but I'm sure many people don't even read the label.
Right. Yeah. And it's long.
Yeah, it's long.
Yeah.
It's like 150. It's right at that like max. And I know many. I like to write a 60-word label too, and this is not that. So yeah. No.
I would note that some of you may have seen the exhibition. Oh golly, unnamed faces.
Unnamed figures. Yeah.
Unnamed figures. Is that the Emily Gewalt's show at the that's now out at Deerfield.
Yeah.
That just opened at Deerfield last week. That show, which is all about trying to bring out the Black presence in New England, in particular, the labels are huge, and they are fascinating, but are people going to read them? And I want to hear from the American Folk Art Museum and from Deerfield, like, are people going to read these things? Because we have a limit of 75 to 100 words. And getting those, I read the whole label because I photographed all the labels and read them later. But but that's something we're dealing with. And how do we deal with the visual that we don't have? What could we put with Derby's chair?
I know what you could put.
Yeah.
You have a bell from Elizabeth Derby's house that was absolutely used to like summon a servant. Like, I would put that with the chair.
Okay. That's great. What is this bell here? How does it relate to the piece? I like that idea because it evokes use and people and the people moving around these objects.
And that leisure labor balance, right? The person ringing the bell and the person attending to the bell.
That has so much to do with the decoration of the
Yes,
interior
yes,
of Emily Murphy's work and how she's insisting that the cupola is not large enough. And so she's very involved in this decoration.
Very involved. Yeah.
It's also sort of that polite, aestheticized veneer again over this kind of violent controlling.
Yeah.
Summoning.
Yeah. Little ring of a bell. Yeah.
My mom used to give me that bell when I was sick. So it usually lasted about an hour until she took it away again. But
How do you incorporate sound?
Yeah, that's a great question.
In a museum exhibition.
could you ask that again for those who are on Zoom?
How does one incorporate sound into an exhibition? The sound of the bell, does that add to the visitor experience?
I think the sound is a great way, and I think there have been some successful exhibitions that use quotes, quotes of figures such as Phyllis Wheatley or others, read while you're looking at an object to try to give you that different perspective as you're looking at the object. I just experimented with sound in a 20th century gallery, but creating an ambiance means something. And, creating those, they don't have to be distracting sound. They can be just setting a tone. And I think sound is a great way. Do we work with smell? Smell is another interesting way that there's a lot of technology out there that we could harness if we're so interested. But my background, I love thinking about hygiene in the home. Like, I'm not sure those are the smells that we want to bring out. But, I think the landscape of the 18th century smelled very differently than than today.
What
so
about drinking from the cup?
Yes.
That heady smell.
Yeah. and the hygiene of it. You know, like post-pandemic, we're all like, what? You know, how are they doing that? How do we get this across to people today? Yeah.
I remember years ago.
Just hold it a sec. You got to be on the mic.
On the mic. Sounds even more muted than before. I remember years ago at Kensington Palace, visitors would be handed what looked like a rack card, but it was actually a scratch and sniff card where short paragraphs were accompanied in the left-hand label by a sort of scratch area with a key or a pen. It would evoke different scents that you might encounter in the course of your tour around the room, around the house, and it was fantastic.
Did you do it?
Yeah, and it was everything from leather to horses to wood to hay to smoke to spice and so forth. But it was very evocative, very compact. It wasn't intrusive, and you sort of got it just by walking around.
I really love that. The senses, engaging the other senses. I like that idea. Yes.
I have a thought about away from this, but I have to follow up on that and say I remember when one of my students, I guess I took this as a good thing, sent me a postcard when they got to visit the Jorvik Viking Center, and it was a scratch and sniff postcard, and on one side was the buttery and it smelled like apples, and the other side was the latrine. Yeah, I still treasure that card. But I think the last exhibit I did with this, trying to play with this problem was, ended up using touchscreens. And I hate to go too high tech, but I did find a couple things. One is kids love them, and they'll play with them endlessly. But the other thing, too, is it allows you to have multiple levels of interpretation and to let people go deeper, and then also have objects maybe that you don't have in your collection. If you didn't have the bell, for example, you can have an image of the bell and even the sound of the bell, and then they can learn more details. And so to me, it was like, it's kind of it's a shortcut, right, for doing multiple levels of labels in like one place, though admittedly it's a tech solution.
Yeah, I think the tech solutions are, they were so hot for so long, and we, speaking for the Art of the Americas wing, we had all sorts of tech when we opened the wing, and now it's all defunct.
Yeah.
And we have empty things. Keeping them up is hard, and it's a problem. The technology, the platforms, everything changes, and we've had to remove these things.
Every year,
Yeah.
you have to update your lab.
Yep, absolutely. And so that we are trying to think, how can we do a longer term version of that? We do have, our museum just switched to the Bloomberg app for our multimedia devices that are supposed to be both video as well as sound and so forth. And I'm hoping that we can engage more with that, because that is a museum-wide, tried to open up instead of a standalone thing. Right. But that will require people to use their own devices. Yeah. Right. So it's not necessarily a visual, per se, that's a cue. Yep. So I think there's one of my colleagues at the museum, Michael Bramwell, says regularly, and I admire this, you have to have the visual. You can't have the work and you need the counterbalance. If you're going to show a tough work, you need a counterbalance that shows the resilience, shows the and so we're talking a lot, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about what's the role of contemporary art and contemporary artists in telling stories about or other communities, indigenous communities or so forth, and helping us tell stories about the 18th century. And how do you feel about the combination of those? Do you guys have thoughts on that?
Well, I keep thinking about poetry now. And so that's at the top of my mind, because we both brought in historic poetry in our readings of these objects, but could we have, poets reading responses to pieces? I think that could be, and not a visual response then, but something that offers a different kind of perspective on the objects.
You saying
be an auditory element.
Period poems or modern poems?
Period poems got me thinking about it, but I'm thinking about contemporary poets.
Nonie?
Yeah.
I have a question or comment for Ruthie. At the beginning of your presentation, you did quite a nice job of evoking the impact of fancy upon people encountering a chair, this chair, or ones like it, for the first time. And I was thinking, the rest then of your talk really is a kind of chipstone article. What would work on the walls of a museum? And I was trying to think, if you invited people today to think about what objects in our daily lives would have the same impact, where it would stop them cold and say, whoa, that is unlike anything I've ever seen, or that is the most remarkable thing, because that evidently was the impact of a chair like that when new, and it would be a way to engage, to make this object possibly meaningful for visitors today.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. I appreciate that, Tom. I love that idea, and I think what I like so much about that is that it allows you to bring something in that wouldn't necessarily look at all like the chair, like that, right? That it would be the contemporary version of that. Like, I can't believe that, what this is, and maybe it would be something that really messes with materiality. Like, I see a lot of interesting contemporary furniture that's completely beaded and things like that, and is fanciful in a very 21st century way. So thank you. Yeah.
But do we ever have that same sense of awe in today's, with all of the images that we see, with all of the visual saturation that we have? Do we ever have that feeling that is described by those?
I think so. I mean,
Yeah?
it could be a pair of sneakers or
Yeah.
something. It's things that strike you really strongly at the moment that you hadn't thought about or seen before.
Yeah.
And then you move on, but it still has that momentary flash.
Yeah.
I'm going to share a comment from our folks at home. So Emily Murphy from Salem Maritime suggests that you could display the object in the hands of a black mannequin. Rose and Sabe would have been responsible for setting the rooms to rest after being used. We are starting to do this in the Derby House at Salem Maritime.
We lost you towards the end there.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So do you want me to start from the beginning? So you could display the object in the hands of a black mannequin. Rose and Sabe would have been responsible for setting the rooms to rest after being used. We are starting to do this in the Derby House at Salem Maritime. And I think actually I'll say, this is just me now, that I think a lot of historic houses are sort of exploring working with contemporary artists and actually commissioning work. So if we don't have ways to represent people based on the things that they themselves made, can we commission a contemporary artist to represent them in some way, personally?
And we've had a lot of conversations about that. Actually, just today, my colleagues in Art of the Americas met with our colleagues in the contemporary department. And we have some really conflicting feelings about that. What are we burdening these contemporary artists to shoulder? Especially, commissioning is one thing. Another is by just taking their work and putting it in conversation, that we're asking a lot of these individuals and of that artwork. And so I think it can be done really, really well. But I think it can also be done really, really trite. And we have to be very, very careful about that. It's just constantly going back and forth on that, and how much do you do that? How much contemporary, I don't like the term, but contemporary intervention do you do in the 18th century? I don't know yet. We have an amazing collection. We have a gorgeous collection of furniture, silver, portraits, paintings, all of that. I don't want those to all go into the storerooms. I want to be able to bring the stories out with those objects. And the interesting of using a black mannequin or so forth. And one of the things I mentioned earlier is, like, do you have silver in this displayed as if it's in the middle of being polished or so forth, and start talking about who's taking care of this work, as you're thinking about the different, you're looking at the silver and so forth. So those are just some other ideas.
Yeah, something I've thought about is you have, you have inventories of households of, free black people in early Salem. Not many, but there are some. And, the 12 silver spoons are listed. And for me, that makes me think, what assumptions are we bringing to provenance history of objects in our collection that we don't actually know what the provenance history is? And are there ways to actually acknowledge the wider range of people who may have owned these objects? And I'm interested in that because it's a way, to your point, Nonie, of not just representing 18th century black history through the lens of oppression, right? Thinking about ownership as well. It's important too.
Yeah. We have Don here. Not Don, sorry. Dennis. Dennis sitting behind Don.
Have you thought of an intro gallery? And rather than have to cover the same territory in each label, that you have an intro gallery which talks about how things were made in the 18th century and all the aspects of making these, from where the silver came from to the enslavement. Then the labels could be shorter because you're not covering all the same territory over again.
No, that's a really good point, because we know that the same conversation, you could talk about forced labor all throughout, but we don't want to be beating over the head. Not that we want to acknowledge it, it's an important part of the story, but where is that story told best? And it can be acknowledged in other areas, but not the full story, a more deeper story told. We're currently thinking about some sort of broad concepts of, yes, an intro gallery that introduces what we're thinking of as the Americas. What do we mean by that? As well as notions of liberty throughout the Americas in the 18th century, the long 18th century, and what does that term really mean, and how is that different for different people in different locations. But we're also looking at things like galleries potentially that focus around the land and the sea as parts of exchange, modes of exchange, but also modes of extraction. Where are the materials coming out of? How are they? What was the role of the colonies in their original creation? So, yes, I'm not sure we will do a materials gallery per se, but that will be through it. And I totally hear you. You don't need to hear the same thing over and over. And that's, I think, a trap that a lot of institutions have fallen into, is that they feel that they have to damn the slave owner in every single label. And yes, we do not condone that, but it was the economy of the day. And we have to acknowledge it. We have to recognize it was part of it, but we don't have to continue to. It's not the only story that we want to tell.
I was struck by your interest in the heraldry.
I need to learn a lot more.
Well, it'd be interesting to know whether or not do you know about the Gore roll?
Excuse me?
The Gore roll.
No.
Well, the Gore roll of heraldry.
Oh, yes. Okay, yes.
Yes. And if it's listed on that roll, then it tells where it came from, who drew it.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is at the same time that was being created, and I'm sure it's a creation, it isn't an inherited. And many black families, free black families in Newport, Rhode Island, and in Martha's Vineyard were also creating heraldry for themselves.
Very cool.
Because heraldry tells the story of what a family believes about themselves.
Yeah.
And so they were, and many of those are listed on the Gore roll.
That's wonderful. Thank
That's
you.
fascinating.
Yeah. I've just dipped my toe into heraldry because I started saying, let me just go to this. Sorry for don't get sick. Who decides everything. You have the coat of arms, which is just the little center, and then you have the crest. Who decides what the rest looks like? What all the foliage is and what all those stools are?
Well, right now, the College of Heraldry, the Windsor Herald, John Petrie, who is a member of the Somerset Club and of the Order of St. John, he designs new heraldry for people.
This is somebody I need to talk to. You know,
I love that.
yeah, absolutely. And the concept of making this new heraldry and creating a family recognition of value, but so much of this, all the cartouche stuff around the sides, I think that from what I can tell so far, it comes down to the silversmith. That's just
it's
ornament.
created first by the person who designed the herald itself.
The coat of arms and the crest,
Everything.
including all of the.
Yes.
Okay. Interesting, because I know that when you look at silver, for example, you see in several of Heard's pieces the same sort of surround around different coats of arms.
So a member of the Colonial Society, Brenton Simons, had John Petrie design for him
Okay.
a new coat of arms.
Okay.
And
All right.
so did,
See, this is exactly why I want to learn more. I want to learn more because this goes
and
to.
Doris Kearns Goodwin has just
Yes.
done that.
Okay.
She is just
I'll just call her up. Yeah.
You can. Sure, lots of people have.
Yeah, sure. She'll friend me. Thank you. These are great ideas to explore because you start looking online and you get to the Martha Gandy Fales publications and so forth. But I'd love to talk to somebody who's working with the concepts right now.
Well, John Lewis also had a crest designed for him by the New England College of Heraldry, which was not. It was an artifact. It didn't really exist, but they pretended they had the authority.
Sounds very New England, yes.
I was going to say colonial, but yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say colonial.
I have two questions, but one is a quick follow-up to this discussion, which is, did Heard do his own engraving? Wasn't it thought that Turner did most of the engraving for most of the silversmiths in Boston in the 1740s?
It's a good question. Interestingly, the portrait of Nathaniel Heard that is done later has books in it, including a heraldry book. And it's believed that he inherited those books from oh golly, Jerry's yelling at me right now. It might have been. It might have been. I can get that information, but it's believed that he inherited that from his father because it was a book that was published in 1720s. So that believed that Jacob Heard had possession of heraldry and so forth, and that he did do some of his engraving. He had such a big shop, and he did so much. His son was very well known for his engraving, so he learned somewhere. And so I believe Heard did do engraving. Whether he did all the engraving in his shop, I doubt, but I don't know. And I would go back to Barbara Ward's entry on Heard in the big Kane volume, which is a wonderful look at Heard and his practice. Yeah.
And then my other question is about the Derby family. You all have been talking about the enslaved people in his household, but is there any evidence that he also had indentured people? Because I'm thinking of the Pickman family, which I've done a lot of work on, and in Pickman III's will, he leaves to his wife all interests and all servants I may have, whether they be white or black. So he specifically talks about owning white people, although more temporarily.
I don't know. I do. Bentley comes up here, actually, Don, if you want to channel this. Bentley talks about that there's a structure in the garden where servants live, and old servants live at Derby's house, and and it's hard to tell from that because there's not a lot of context whether he's talking about this kind of unfree population or if he's talking about white servants. I don't know.
And this mix of race, class, and everything is we need to. It's such a phrase out. Complicate it more.
That to me seems to be what's getting lost in the conversation about race is that whiteness in many places, like at the MFA, comes off as yes, the elites in the Copley paintings, and then here's the empty enslaved person who is missing. And in between there's a whole vast range of people who are not in the conversation as scholarship has been developing from my point of view in the last few years.
Yeah. I think you're completely right. I think like class is a blind spot in museums in every imaginable way. So,
and I think one of the ways we get to that is not something necessarily new. It's the makers.
Yeah.
Many of the makers. I mean, I would counter that with Pat Lyon at the Forge. Our massive George big painting of Pat Lyon at the Forge shows a workman at his work. Obviously, he did very well for himself, but trying to show that, and even Revere's choice of showing himself as a workman is another way of bringing out those stories that there and Heard, that poor guy, did not, we think of all this beautiful silver that he made, and he died insolvent, with 14 children, unfortunately he kept naming kids Prudence, and they kept dying. So stop naming them Prudence. But it's. I think the craftsman can get us to a lot of those stories as well. Yeah.
I'm wondering also how productive it can be to think about absence and play into that too, because I know that's sometimes a conceptual leap for sometimes museum visitors when it's not right in front of you, but leaning into who's not depicted in a painting when we don't have enough black figures or enslaved figures in portraits or paintings themselves. I know it. I should say I'm at Historic Deerfield, and I worked on the unnamed figures iteration of it.
Gotcha.
And we were incorporating our own permanent collection objects to fill in some of the gaps into the exhibition, working with a collection that does not have enough, obviously, black figures in the portraits, but playing off that absence about who's looking at these and experiencing an object itself when they're not even in the frame.
And I think that can be expanded to the indigenous communities as well. We have these beautiful paintings of landscapes that were inhabited, and they're completely erased from there, or happily over in a corner. Absence, I think, is hard. And you mentioned earlier the empty frame that we have. My colleagues and I are sort of like, okay, we've done that. It's time to move on. But it's used. It's used all the time. The gallery guides, people use it, people respond to it. And just because we might be ready to move on, if it's working with visitors, if it's getting a point across, maybe we don't throw it out yet. So that's just something we have to balance as well.
So quickly in response to that, before I get to my actual question, is that I'm willing to go on the record and say that I am sick of seeing Kehinde Wiley installed next to 18th century portraiture. I just came from a fellowship at the Huntington and was kind of disappointed to see that it's just imperviated every... Yeah, right? It's just everywhere now, and I feel like it is convenient, and maybe it does work for visitors, but it feels like it's doing a disservice to both artworks. I don't think the dialogue, at least when I've tried to teach it to students, it doesn't seem to make the impression that is desired. And so I would like to see fewer of those installations happening in museums currently. But as far as...
Our head of contemporary department agrees with you.
Excellent. But as far as installations and what can activate a space in a different way, I think bringing the materials into the space, showing pigments, showing pieces of
raw goods and mahogany, right, gold, and putting those on display and sort of having a discussion about labor and the labor that went into art making from raw materials onward is a really good way to get viewers cued into sort of the transformative power that was necessary in order to make art happen. And so I'm curious if that's been something that the MFA is thinking about.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I think that those are all great suggestions. And it's funny, when I started doing this panel, I wanted to focus on materials and really focus in on things. And we morphed into something a little different. But that is something that's of keen importance to me, of how to bring those stories in. And yes, the raw materials, I think, it's not necessarily anything that places haven't done, but we can continue to bring those stories. And one of the thing that I love about that is emphasizing the global aspects. And so many of these works have influence from so many aspects of the world. And here, general audience might think of Boston as a a sort of tight-knit community in the 18th century, when it was a global community. And I love bringing out those parts.
Yeah.
Does the MFA have fellowships that sort of support artists working, to mine the kind of historical material, but making their own work, where it's not so much focused on the product that's coming out of it, but the relationship and that process? So I think that could be really important. I see that as really important too, thinking about how people now are makers also, and we can sustain them and help them find things that really excite them in our collection.
No, I think that's very true. We don't currently have that. We have the School of the Museum of Fine Arts, which is now part of Tufts University, but we don't have a standing sort of artist residency of that kind. We do have programs such as where we have developed a program called Table of Voices that is funded by Joyce Lindy, and or the late Joyce Lindy, and that program is basically our acknowledgement that the museum staff doesn't know everything. They haven't had all experiences. And so we reach out into the community and bring together people of different backgrounds, artists and people of all sorts of different, that we think have perspectives that can inform our exhibitions. And it has been proving really, really valuable. I got to work with a team, a Table of Voices cohort for the Toshiko Takiezu exhibition that I have on view right now. And they really helped me shape how to present this story to a modern audience. And that is going to be key for us in this process. We are hoping to have a convening in the fall that incorporates a large number of artists and so forth to try to keep those sort of conversations going. So I think that's a vital aspect.
I think it's exciting too to think about people in the galleries having conversations with each other, not just with the work of art. To me, like that would be very exciting to see, and that's also how I think people that are really interested in the 18th century, that's how our love of it developed, right? In conversation with other people who cared about it. So just like ways to provoke that, this idea of the table of voices seems appealing.
Well, I say table of voices, and your card table just came to mind. I mean, that table has so many voices in it, and what it could tell us about history. That
one thing I just wanted to say about the raw materials, which I think is really important, and I like to see it in galleries. It's also like it's a construct, it's thinking about indigenous perspectives with things like silver, metal, clay, and it's not just, it's like that. If we bring in those types of materials, then it's important to talk about what they mean among different communities, and not just as the ingredients for colonialism. Yeah.
I think that's a really good point.
I've been around the block for a few years, and what is really striking me about this conversation is how many times I've had it previously over so many years. And I'm really thinking back to Fred Wilson's Mining the Museum, which many of you are too young to have experienced that, but that was one of the truly great breakthroughs in terms of how to tell those missing stories. It was at the Maryland Historical Society the year before Dennis became director there, and you know, he had nothing to do with it, but it really did sort of move the dial in terms of interpretation in a history museum.
It comes up often in our conversations.
Still,
and that is the role of bringing an artist in to have the conversation and to help you. And we were talking about that role, not only a commission of an artist, but bringing an artist to work with your collection.
But couple that with, you know, I loved hearing all of the presentations, and it brought me back to my love of the decorative arts and this sort of anthropological approach to unpacking the meaning of an object. And I loved all of this, but I go back always to the audience, and there's way too much content for any average person going through the MFA to understand all of the stories they want to tell. And I think that's the challenge. When we redid the Concord Museum galleries, to get back to Dennis's point of intro galleries, we spent a lot of time working with focus groups and others thinking about, is there a way of giving people going through in an intro gallery the tools for unpacking objects? And regardless of what this, it goes back to Mac Fleming at Winterthur, and you know, you want to look at whether it's materials or craftsmanship or provenance or owner or materials or whatever, and these other hidden stories. I mean, it does feel as though that's another area you could explore. But I must say, it's really frustrating to be still at my age now, thinking we're still trying to figure out a way of telling stories without overwhelming the audience with too much content. So,
and you know, what my colleagues and I, when we decided to put our stake in the ground with this, it's scary. You know, we say we're going to do this. I'm here publicly saying this is what we're trying to do. We will not please everybody. We will not get everything right. We will fail at times, but we feel that we need to make the effort, and we need to take, because I think a lot of times people don't do something because they're scared of failing, especially in this realm of what we're talking about. So I think we're willing to take that risk because the step has to be taken. Not that we're the only ones doing it. Everybody's trying to do it, but that's part of what we have a large platform.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you.